Good morning, everyone. I am beside myself excited to welcome you here. This is Open the Paths 2025. This is our 8th year, and I'm kind of in disbelief that we've managed to keep this going. I think there's not a more exciting year than this because we're very, very close to knowing about almost every sidewalk in the state of Washington. And this is all thanks to work, yes, my team, but this is everybody in this room has been a contributor to active transportation in some way, shape, or form that has moved the needle on how we measure, address, and look at active transportation in the state. And I think, when 7, 8 years ago, I would come into a room and say the word sidewalk and people would laugh me out of the room. And I think now that there's acknowledgement in how important that infrastructure is to both understand how we're all connected, how we connect to essential services, and really how we address the needs of every traveler out there, ensuring that we have people who can and should be connected to their communities, that they're actually connected to them. So I wanted to start out by just acknowledging folks on my team that made this happen. I see, the Gaussian Solutions team is over here. Suresh Developoli. And everybody on the TCAT team, please stand up because I wanted to ensure that you're acknowledged. Awesome. And special thanks to Amara and Tanisha, who you'll see soon, because they really did a ton of lift for this event to happen. So thank you for that. So we have a really exciting day of presentations. I can't wait to hear what people have to say. We have a star-studded cast here, and I'm really excited about the conversations we're about to have. I wanted to go through a couple of logistics. The restrooms are outside the room over there and down the hallway to the right. We do have folks assisting. If you have a vision disability and need to know how to get around, just raise your hand and someone will come up to you. I want to acknowledge our sponsors. Sorry about that. We have some really nice sponsorship from the King County Future of Mobility Coalition and King County Metro, as well as HopeLink and HopeLink Mobility, and the Tasker Center Endowment Fund has also contributed. And lastly, Microsoft AI for Accessibility is also a contributor here, and I wanted to acknowledge everybody that helped move that along. Thank you. All right, without further ado, I want to introduce our keynote speaker today. Arman Shahbazian is the Electric and Automated Mobility Policy Advisor at City of Seattle's Department of Transportation. He leads SDOT's work in autonomous transportation, including launching one of the very first city permit programs for autonomous vehicle testing. Arman also coordinates SDOT's transportation electrification efforts to achieve the 2030 goals set in Seattle's Clean Transportation Electrification Blueprint. He is a career public servant and Washington resident, having worked in a variety of engineering roles at Seattle City Lights and Tacoma Power prior to this current position. Arman holds a Master's of Public Administration and a BS in Electrical Engineering from Seattle University. And I want to acknowledge that Arman's been a really awesome community contributor in the space of accessible and legible transportation. He's been a partner in a number of different coalitions that I've acknowledged his, both presence and contributions there. And I really am so excited to welcome you to the podium. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. All right, that was such a great intro. It's really such a pleasure to be here today to talk about autonomous transportation. Autonomous transportation feels a little bit of an esoteric subject because you probably don't see or experience autonomous vehicles traveling on Seattle streets today. We do have testing, which I'll get into shortly. However, autonomous vehicles are really starting to pop up in many cities, and making sure that we are anticipating what those impacts and opportunities will be is really important to us as we work towards delivering a transportation network that provides more options for everyone. So as mentioned, I work at the Seattle Department of Transportation. We manage the public right-of-way, which includes streets, sidewalks, planting strips. Basically anything that's outside of the building is what we manage. And we've really shifted to work towards equitable transportation that provides a menu of options so that you can pick what works best for you, which is in support of our core values and goals. The reason this is important is 27% of Seattle's land area is public right-of-way. That's actually more land than parks in the city of Seattle. So managing the streets, sidewalks, and planting strips is really important because it is such a large public asset. And we also know that this public asset can have really big impacts that are both positive and negative. Positives, we all use transportation to get here today, a great positive. A negative is that 60% of Seattle's greenhouse gas emissions are from transportation. In Seattle, we're really lucky to have abundant hydropower. As a result, our buildings are very efficient, but our transportation network is not. So we're really looking towards the future to see what options we can introduce that will help reduce this large share as we work towards our climate goals. So to sum up, at SDOT, our influence over street design, space allocation among travel options, and supportive programs means that we really play a central role in how we're designing the public space in these streets to serve everyone. Transportation is not static. The image you see is of 2nd Avenue and James Street in downtown Seattle. And in the image, it shows, pointing north, a variety of streetcar tracks and lots of pedestrians on a wide sidewalk. This was from 1906, so 120 years ago. Streetcars were very dominant. People were walking, accessing businesses on a more human scale. Today, that same intersection looks very different. It's primarily dedicated to car travel, and now, notably, we do have a protected bike lane corridor. However, you see much less pedestrians, the sidewalk is actually narrower, and you see less public life happening on these streets. So transportation is really dynamic, and it is not something that remains static, and it should be something that we're always looking to improve on. Innovation is also changing how we access these places and opportunities. In Seattle, you can now use a seated scooter to get around, and you can also call a ride from your phone or app using Metroflex to connect to transit that might not be frequent to where you are, so an on-demand service can come and pick you up. And both of these options really highlight the importance of the collaboration with the private sector and really leveraging new innovation to achieve better transportation access for everyone. The reason this is important is that more choices leads to more opportunities. In the past, car transportation has really dominated what transportation looks like in Seattle and the surrounding area. And as you can see from this image, it's not great. It's lots of emissions, lots of noise. It can create safety conflicts between people who are driving and people who are walking and rolling. And we really want to offer a menu of choices so that if you are able to drive, for example, you're not forced to do so. And if you can't drive, you're not stuck at home because you can't access the places you'd like to be. Some of these choices include rapid ride bus service, where it comes so frequently that you don't have to check a schedule. I mentioned micromobility, providing that first last mile on-demand rides that are really affordable. Link Light Rail, which connects you to some of our larger destinations that are far away, like the airport. Electric car share, which is starting to pop up in Seattle, if you do need a car and you can drive, to give you opportunities to get outside of the city. And sometime in the future, that might look like autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles are something that we don't have in Seattle yet, but they're starting to arrive in many cities. This is a photo of a Zoox Robotaxi, purpose-built vehicle that includes only seats for passengers. There's no steering wheel and no pedals. These autonomous vehicles, which are also called AVs or self-driving cars, are now providing passenger service in numerous cities and will soon be a new option if the legislation that we're tracking will end up playing out. You might wonder how we got from that robo-taxi today. It's important that we look back at what autonomous vehicles looked like many years ago. This is a photo of Carnegie Mellon's entrant into an autonomous vehicle developer challenge about 25 years ago. And they essentially took a Hummer, chopped it off, added a bunch of computers and sensors, and basically let it go on a rural road. And this was one of the first successful demonstrations of autonomous driving. You might wonder what autonomous vehicles have in common with GPS and the internet. All three of these technologies are all interlinked together. Autonomous vehicles require a strong connection to GPS for their location system, and they also require access to the internet for routing and connection back to their home base. All three of these types of technologies were funded by the federal government's Defense and Research Projects Group. And so this just goes to show when there's energy and money behind something, you can make it happen. So we saw that with autonomous vehicles. We've seen it with GPS and the internet. So this is one reason why we're taking autonomous vehicles seriously, is there's a lot of momentum behind it and a lot of investment. Some examples of autonomous vehicles. This image is a picture of a Waymo robotaxi. It's built on a Jaguar I-Pace vehicle, which you can buy at a dealership. However, on the roof and on the sides, excuse me, you can see a large amount of sensors that are used to allow the vehicle to drive. You saw this earlier, but this is another photo of the Zoox robotaxi. It's a purpose-built vehicle, includes no steering wheel, no pedals. It has no ability to be driven by a human. It only includes 4 seats just for passengers. This is a photo of an Aurora semi-truck. It's built on an existing semi-truck platform, but includes the hardware to allow it to drive autonomously. And these are driving autonomously in Texas. And then the last example is of a different type of service, shuttle style, which use small vehicles for low-speed service, typically on campuses and closed routes. However, the types of autonomous vehicles that we're most concerned and interested about are the first two, which are providing essentially a taxi-style service today. So to set the stage, I'm going to go over how autonomous vehicles are regulated in the United States to provide some context as to why vehicles are operating in certain markets and not others. To start us off, there are no federal safety standards that concern the capabilities of automated driving systems. Essentially, the federal government has not stepped in to set any requirements for how these vehicles should drive or to understand how these vehicles are programmed to drive. In the absence of having no federal standards, states are relying on what's called self-certification, or essentially an assurance from the industry that their technology is ready for public roadways without any external validation. Self-certification is something that the aviation industry also uses, and it was most notably involved in the Boeing 737 MAX incident, where Boeing self-certified that their technology met a certain standard when it ultimately didn't. So self-certification is something that causes us quite a bit of concern as we think about it. Washington State does allow autonomous vehicles to test on public roadways using the self-certification process. They also allow testing both with and without safety drivers. So to zoom out for the whole country, there's about 20% of the states allow testing, including Washington, and an even greater amount of states now allow for autonomous vehicle commercial deployment. So that means either providing passenger service or allowing autonomous semi-trucks to operate on public roadways. However, there are only a handful of states that have public AV service today, and those cities that you can ride in an autonomous vehicle are San Francisco, Phoenix, Austin, and Los Angeles. However, by 2026, this list will grow to include Las Vegas, Atlanta, Miami, and Washington, D.C. Something that all of these states have in common is what's called preemption, which essentially is a legal doctrine that allows the upper level of government, in this case the state, to restrict or prevent the lower level of government, which would be the city or county, from self-regulating. So essentially in all of these states where autonomous vehicles are operating, the city and the county has no regulatory ability to set any performance standards, charge any fees, or otherwise have any control over how autonomous vehicles are operated on their city streets. The reason this is important is AV companies are seeking legislation to fully deploy autonomous vehicles for commercial service in Washington state, and their proposed legislation includes the preemption of local regulations. This is not the first time that we've experienced this. Looking back to when Uber, Lyft, and other transportation network companies, or TNCs, launched in Seattle back in 2011, 2012, they launched quickly. First came Uber, then came Lyft, then came regulations for Uber and Lyft, and then came state law that eventually led to the preemption of city and county regulations on Uber and Lyft. This is what we call the TNC playbook, which is the move fast and break things playbook. Essentially what they did is they rapidly scaled. From this rapid scale, they were able to build public pressure because people started using the service and they liked the service. So if they threatened to stop offering the service, the public would come out in their favor to say, no, we want to keep the service. This allowed the companies to effectively lobby state governments. It also allowed them to leverage successful legal challenges, and finally resulting in implementing regulatory preemption. So today, cities like Seattle have no regulatory authority over TNCs like Uber and Lyft, so we can't set performance standards, charge fees, et cetera, et cetera. Essentially, what we saw with TNCs is that many of the promises that they gave us, reducing congestion, reducing vehicle miles traveled, facilitating a car-free lifestyle, carrying more passengers, and expanding mobility for non-drivers, didn't come true. And the reason this concerns us is because we hear almost the exact same message from autonomous vehicle companies, but we are not confident that that will be realized as they offer commercial service in the markets that they've begun launching in. Specifically, from our peer cities that have collected data, we know that as much as 61% of TNC trips substituted for transit, walking, or bike travel, or would not have been made at all. And TNCs almost never provide accessible rides. And if they are providing accessible rides, it was because of lots of advocacy and legislative fights. So what did cities learn? Well, we were very prepared when scooter and bike share arrived because we had that experience of dealing with Uber and Lyft. Seattle was one of the first US cities to experience free-floating bike share in 2017, and then scooters arrived in 2020. Today, the service is highly successful. We delivered more than 6 million trips on shared micromobility, and our year-over-year growth is in the double digits. So we're really looking forward to smashing through that record for 2025. The reason the ridership is so successful is because we collect and use robust and large amounts of data. This is a screenshot from our trip summary page, which allows us to see day by day to the hour what trips are taking place, where they're taking place, on what mode, which types of users, et cetera, et cetera. For example, we know from our 6 million trips, 500,000 of those trips were taken by folks that use the discount programs, which is really exciting to know that we're providing a transportation choice for people who might not be able to afford taking a different transportation mode. We're also able to hold vendors accountable for equity deployment. So we require a minimum distribution of vehicles in equity deployment areas. And because we're getting real-time location information from their devices, we're able to verify that they're actually abiding by the requirements we've set and distributing their fleet throughout the city equitably. This is all data that we would like to leverage for example, Uber, Lyft in the future autonomous vehicles, but because the regulatory landscape remains so uncertain, we're not sure if we can actually operationalize that. So essentially, we adapted to what these new transportation technologies were. We learned from the TNC playbook. We were more aggressive with micromobility than what we were with TNCs. We were able to implement things like permits and other regulations more quickly to get ahead of the challenges. And importantly, we were able to use data sharing and digital tools to actually realize what the collaboration looks like. And finally, active management and coordination was an expectation with the vendors. So we have really active engagement with these companies, which is something we don't have with Uber, Lyft, and something we hope to have with the AV companies. So concerns and opportunities for autonomous vehicles. Currently, there are no available or planned purpose-built autonomous vehicles that are wheelchair accessible. The image you see is of a prototype autonomous vehicle from a company called Cruise, which is no longer in business, and they were the only company that developed a prototype wheelchair accessible autonomous vehicle. However, they're no longer in business, so their vehicle no longer exists, and there's no other company that stepped up to develop something similar. The reason this is because some tasks, actually many tasks, are difficult to automate. One of those tasks being securing wheelchairs or other mobility devices. Currently, there's no standardized way to do so. And so, for example, if you were to ride in that Cruise Origin, you would actually need a companion to secure your wheelchair if you were using one. And this is a big challenge for autonomous vehicles. When you fully remove the human from the operation, you're not able to have a human-to-human connection to facilitate some of those tasks that require human-to-human connection. Regulatory preemption also prevents cities and counties from requiring discount programs or integration with existing fare systems. We have a great discount program for transit here, but if we are losing our ability to regulate, we can't require that the systems are integrated. There's also lots of challenges with curb loading, which includes double parking, stopping in travel lanes, which can result in access and safety issues. This is an image I took actually of a Waymo in Los Angeles that stopped to do a pickup in the right turn lane at a green light, not fully at the curb, which can create a lot of challenge if you are trying to get into this vehicle, and also if you're another road user. We're also concerned that congestion might increase without local input on fleet size, deployment areas, and routing. Here's a photo of 3 autonomous vehicles bunched together. We're very concerned that autonomous vehicles will deadhead or drive without being in service, which is a big issue with TNCs like Uber and Lyft. However, there are some opportunities. AVs may offer safety benefits that include quick reaction times, driving the speed limit, and not driving drunk or drowsy. This video is of a Waymo vehicle in Austin, Texas, which was traveling behind someone riding a scooter who hit an obstacle and fell into the roadway, and the vehicle was able to react very quickly to swerve and not hit this person. So there are opportunities that we do see with the technology of autonomous vehicles and their ability to be monitoring their surroundings constantly. Autonomous vehicles also offer a consistent experience for users. For example, we've heard from folks in the blind community who use AVs in other markets that they really enjoy that every time they call a vehicle, it's the same vehicle every time. So they know where the handle is, they know where the seatbelt buckle is, they know where all the controls are. And then also that autonomous vehicles don't discriminate against passengers who use service animals. We've heard from folks who use service animals that they've been denied rides in Ubers and Lyfts because they have a service animal, which is not legally allowed, but drivers, you don't have a recourse if you're a passenger and your driver leaves. But AVs don't discriminate in that way. Autonomous vehicles can also offer unique features such as audio and visual cues to find the car. The apps can also dynamically route you to where the vehicle is waiting. And so there's a lot of technology integration that has positives for access. So what have we seen in peer cities? As I mentioned, Seattle is more of a nascent market because we're a testing only state. We don't have deployment. So we really look to our peer cities to see what their experiences have been to get ready for what we might see in Seattle. However, we have seen some cases that give us pause. The most notable is the operation of Cruise, which was an autonomous vehicle company that was operating in many states. They had their largest operations in San Francisco. Cruise caused many challenges for the San Francisco transportation system. This photo is of a Cruise autonomous vehicle that drove through a work zone into wet cement. This is a photo of a Cruise vehicle that could not detect the length of an articulated bus and rear-ended it. This is a photo of another Cruise vehicle that boxed in another bus. This is a photo of two Cruise vehicles, one which drove through caution tape and the second which drove through a downed power line that was blocked off with the caution tape. And then this was of a Cruise vehicle that was carrying a passenger that drove in front of a responding fire truck and was T-boned. These are really, these instances give us a lot of pause because these are cases that most attent human drivers would not have resulted in. And also when there's issues with the Cruise driving system, it applies to their entire fleet. So if one Cruise vehicle drives through wet cement, it can be assumed that all of them will drive through wet cement because of a programming issue. This was most salient for an incident which ultimately led to Cruise shutting down, which was on October 2nd, 2023. A pedestrian in a crosswalk was hit by a human-driven vehicle. However, the Cruise vehicle that was in the adjacent lane then subsequently hit the pedestrian and dragged her for 20 feet. The reason this happened are numerous failings with how Cruise designed their driving system. What we know from the incident report is that the Cruise driving system accelerated toward a pedestrian that was directly in front of it in a crosswalk. The pedestrian was crossing against the signal. However, the vehicle did detect this person and continued to accelerate, which reduced its reaction time. We also know that as the system tracked this person, it continued to move forward through that impact with the vehicle in the adjacent lane. We also know that the Cruise system had a visual view of the legs of the pedestrian being dragged in the vehicle's cameras, but that the driving system wasn't programmed to take in that information, so it continued its forward movement with the pedestrian trapped underneath. An engineering firm that was hired to evaluate how the system performed stated that an alert and attentive human driver would have been aware that an impact of some sort had occurred and would not have continued driving. This causes us lots of concern. I mentioned if one vehicle has a programming issue, the whole fleet has a programming issue. And so at the time, Cruise was operating just under 1,000 vehicles. While this was a very unique case, it still remains to be said that when there's incidents with humans, you can't necessarily say that that incident will apply to every human because we all make dynamic choices with how we conduct, for example, our driving task. Further in the investigation, the investigator that Cruise did hire stated that they had poor judgment, poor leadership, lack of coordination, and an us versus them mentality with regulators. I thought this was very notable because that is the experience we often have with the autonomous vehicle industry, is an us versus them mentality. At the end of the day, we're really trying to offer a suite of transportation choices, but we have many concerns from the community, from the traveling public, and this us versus them mentality is not workable when we're trying to find new transportation solutions. The report further stated that Cruise had a self-inflicted wound and appeared to not have fully appreciated how a regulated business should interact with its regulators. And this was really notable because it was the first time that there was acknowledgement of this tension between autonomous vehicle companies that fight for no regulations and cities, counties, and states that are trying to regulate appropriately for this new technology. So what can our region do to prepare for AVs? Our first effort was, well, I wouldn't say our first effort. Our most recent effort was in 2023. We worked with the city of Bellevue to create what we called a strategic vision for automated vehicles. Essentially, it's a framework for a set of tasks that we can try to work towards as we prepare for autonomous vehicles to arrive in our region, recognizing that AVs are unique. They're not scooters. They don't just operate in one specific market. They'll be traveling throughout the region, and we should have a coordinated approach. So what we stated was that managing the advancement and utilization of technologies such as AVs should require a cohesive vision, collaborative partnerships, and conscientious decision-making about which regional priorities are supported by policy. That last statement is very important to us because something that we continue to do, especially with our state delegation, is say, what priorities are you going to support with the policies you're supporting? So I'll just quickly go through what those priorities are. The first is to leverage strategic collaborations. We want to make sure that the communities are engaged in decision-making. We want to collaborate with the AV industry to form beneficial alliances. We want two-way communication between the community and the industry, and we want mutually beneficial data sharing. Ensuring safety. We want permit requirements for AV testing and operations. We want to collaborate with regional, state, and federal agencies so that there's consistency with our requirements. And we want transparent data sharing for the reporting of AV testing and operations. We want to shape innovation. We want to continue monitoring advancements in the AV industry to understand what's working, what's not working, and we want to make sure that these emerging mobility options are accessible to everyone. We want to ensure transportation equity. So we want to provide public outreach and educational opportunities and also formalize key performance indicators to actually understand how effective AV services are at meeting transportation goals. We want to increase mobility options. This looks like identifying high priority community-focused use cases, championing projects that are a right fit, and searching for goals among stakeholders in other jurisdictions. And finally, we want to enhance sustainability. The big piece of this is emphasizing the need to reduce deadheaded miles, also assessing our curb loading zones and setting policies so that we can be adaptable for what vehicle transportation will look like in the future. So what is Seattle doing to advance these priorities? First is our AV testing permit program, which we launched in November 2022. The launch happened after companies began testing in a more sustained manner in Seattle, and we said, the state self-certification system is not working. Essentially, all companies have to do is fill out a 1.5-page PDF with like 5 checkboxes to the state, and that's it. There's no check-in. There's really no oversight. And so what we did was we launched a permit program that would cover all types of autonomous vehicles to make sure we're not leaving any loopholes. We have a test driver requirement and a driver training program requirement. Companies have to submit to us a first responder interaction and disengagement plan. They also have to train our first responders at a physical demonstration event. We also have the highest insurance requirements for autonomous vehicle testing in the country, and we require companies to indemnify the city for how they conduct their operations. What this looks like is we have 2 permittees. We're really excited because these 2 permittees are actually the only companies with active testing in the state. The first is Zoox. Zoox is eventually going to provide robotaxi ride-hailing services. And the second is NVIDIA Corporation. NVIDIA provides the hardware and software to other OEMs like Zoox. So they will not provide a public service, but they continue to test their technology here. What this partnership looks like is, and by partnership I mean a requirement of our permit, is first responder training as an example. So this was from an event we did with Zoox, where they brought their test vehicle to our facility. They provided a training to police, fire, and transportation staff. Our teams got to be inside the vehicle to see how to physically disengage it should the test driver be incapacitated. So it was really a great opportunity to have hands-on time with the vehicle and our first responders. The second initiative is our community-led engagement work. So to address the specific challenges and opportunities that come from autonomous vehicles, we established the Autonomous Vehicle Inclusive Planning Cohort. The cohort was a group dedicated to ensuring that the introduction of AVs in Seattle benefits everyone and aligns with our goals. This process is an opportunity to demonstrate what it looks like when those most affected by potential impacts lead in setting community priorities for local and state government policies. So who is the AV Inclusive Planning Cohort? It is community members with personal and professional expertise and those who represent local community-based organizations, coalitions, and networks. And I see Doreen in the audience. Doreen was part of our cohort. Shout out to Doreen. So what did the cohort do? They participated in a 6-month series of facilitated discussions. We worked with a facilitation consultant and the University of Oregon, who's an academic leader in emerging mobility. We compensated the cohort for sharing their lived experiences, recognizing that this is really important work and we shouldn't have an expectation that the community should do this work for free. The cohort ended up arriving at 7 priorities to guide our discussions and recommendations. From those priorities, we developed a racial equity toolkit that we use internally to set our processes and also understand the impacts of autonomous vehicles for our city programs. And we continue to provide regular updates and opportunities for cohort participation. So those community priorities, in no particular order, include management and accountability. So understanding that community voices should be at the forefront of the city's expectations of the AV industry. I won't read you all these quotes, but essentially these are quotes taken directly from cohort members during our discussions. And this was really salient because there was active discussion about, will autonomous services even provide a benefit to me, or will they provide a benefit to people that have many transportation choices to them? I thought this was very important as we think about who these services are for. Next is workforce protection and development, understanding that worker benefits should be prioritized and that job displacement should be counteracted. We also had many discussions about should AV companies have a hand in doing this retraining and can we require it? That job training is fine, but it might not be the same skill set you have, and that jobs are not just transferable. And that we should be conscious of timelines because there's evidence that by the time someone might have caught up, the job market may have already moved on. Next is accessibility and affordability, that all communities should have equal access to these services, and that we should address accessibility and affordability barriers. Accessibility is very multidimensional, and that we shouldn't subsidize a service that isn't accessible. Safety, that AV operators surpass safety benchmarks, and that we work with operators to build trust throughout all stages, from testing through operation. There was also discussion about who's liable in incidents, and also will it be realistic for members of the public to pursue claims, especially when these companies are owned by such large corporations and have such institutional and monetary power. Also, the understanding that vehicles should follow all the traffic laws and that there should be less leniency for autonomous vehicles than human drivers because they're not a human. Environmental impacts, that AVs should have a positive environmental impact on the city and also include intersectional health and equity criteria. There was discussion that AVs could be positive because they tend to be all electric and that the use of electric cars can have a positive environmental impact in urban areas. However, an understanding that electric vehicles do require a lot of materials and understanding what the full life cycle looks like for these vehicles to make sure that they're not overburdening the environmental system. Intersectional equity, that AV deployment is planned to holistically consider social identities and impacts, and that AV deployment can correct past discrimination, especially for those that have been harmed by transportation planning that we have done poorly in the past. This looks like the city motivating or requiring vendors to answer key questions so that communities feel informed and good about the services. And then finally, education to community, recognizing that it's not predictable or linear, but that we should build trust through collaboration, and also acknowledging where we may have misstepped as we work towards AV operation in Seattle. Just an understanding that Seattle residents make decisions off of a variety of factors and that they really care about the services that are available to them. We're also using data to improve operations. We know that autonomous vehicles struggle with interpreting human traffic control commands, recognizing first responders, and that they have issues detecting fire hoses and emergency tape. This is a screenshot from a body camera from a firefighter in San Francisco who was unable to get a Waymo autonomous vehicle to come into a scene that firefighters were at, even while using a flare. Autonomous vehicles are able to receive remote fleet support, but at the end of the day, the driving task has to be executed by the vehicle. And if this is not successful, then fleet support must travel to retrieve the vehicle. This was a case of a Waymo vehicle that was traveling up a street that a fire truck began turning onto, and the fire truck needed clearance to continue the turn, but the Waymo vehicle was unable to reverse. So what does this look like now? Essentially, it's very messy and complicated. If an autonomous vehicle gets stuck, especially near firefighters or first responders, often AV companies ask that those first responders call remote fleet support, which is challenging because firefighters and police officers often aren't carrying cell phones. In the case of firefighters, they're often wearing helmets and gloves, so it's challenging to make a phone call, let alone remember what the phone number should be. After that initial contact is made, there has to be lots of coordination between that remote fleet support and their field support who might go out to tow the vehicle. Ultimately, what it results in is many delays and first responders having to do something that's outside of their job duty. So what tools can we leverage? What we're implementing in Seattle is using what's called the Mobility Data Specification. It's an open data standard that was actually created by the city of Los Angeles to prepare for autonomous vehicles. This was many years ago. However, at the time that they were developing this data standard was when scooters and bike share began arriving in cities. So they pivoted and they adapted this data standard to manage scooters and bikes. So that data dashboard I shared earlier from our system uses the mobility data specification. We're hoping to integrate the MDS with autonomous vehicles to move beyond basic warnings using text messages to using dynamic warnings using the MDS. So what that looks like is the system we're proposing to build would take information from Seattle's 911 dispatching system. So this is a screenshot which shows a variety of dispatches that have occurred. For example, one of these dispatches is a fire in an apartment building. So we know that multiple units are going here. We know what the address is. We know what type of emergency it is. From this information, our system will translate key pieces of this information into the mobility data specification, which can be interpreted and read by any connected fleet. Using that, we'll create what's called a geofence, or essentially a warning zone, so that operators would know that there's an incident occurring here. There might be vehicles, you should avoid this area. If it's a particularly large incident, we could also issue a no driving zone along specific frontages, so that, for example, an autonomous vehicle would receive this data automatically and know to route around where this emergency is occurring, which results in better AV operations because they won't get stuck, and it makes sure that first responders are not having to deal with wayward autonomous vehicles. The reason this is important to us is that we know data can improve access. Data sharing has lots of benefits. For example, we use data sharing for incentives and other collaborative services. Two of our most notable uses of data sharing include requiring parking at specific corrals for scooters and bikes so that they avoid blocking the sidewalk. And then also, if you take a scooter or bike share trip to or from a transit station, you now get credits that you can use to take transit or use the service in the future. So this is an example of an opportunity that we could have with autonomous vehicles where you might get incentives, for example, if you connect to transit using a future AV service. So to wrap up, autonomous vehicles are coming. We might not have them now, but we'll probably have them in the future, and we have them testing. Cities should have a seat at the table so that we can uplift what we hear and what we need for our communities. If we continue to wait for AVs to come rather than preparing for them now, we're going to lose the opportunity to shape what AV applications will benefit our region. But if we do shape it, we can guide the deployment of AVs so that they can provide safe and affordable access to places and opportunities. Thank you.
You know, Armin, great presentation this morning, but I got a burning question for you as a transit guy, and that is, how soon can we get autonomous vehicles to support paratransit needs? Because we need vehicles that can go out and pick up paratransit customers and connect them to fixed route and other such services when they deserve those services, which is any time they need it for any reason. And I'll just leave the question open-ended like that so others can ask questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, what we've seen in the cities that have public autonomous vehicle service today is that companies launch in a way that helps them meet a ridership group that provides the best business return for them. So what that looks like is launching in central business districts where there's high Uber Lyft ridership, and then spreading out to higher income areas before they maybe expand to the city more broadly. Also, none of these vehicles are accessible, which makes them challenging to apply for something like paratransit. And all of the cities that they're operating in now, the cities have no ability to require the companies to serve paratransit style uses. I will say my presentation was mostly focused on these large players like Waymo and Zoox. There are some smaller players. One is, for example, May Mobility. They operate autonomous vehicles, but they use a Toyota Sienna platform. So it is wheelchair accessible, and they do have a wheelchair accessible variant. But it still requires a human operator to do loading and unloading. And so what we've seen from the markets that have that service is that the service is beneficial not because it's autonomous, it's beneficial because it's a paratransit service. And so we've struggled to see how there will be applications for paratransit using AVs currently because of the limitations in the vehicle design and the inability to make the companies play ball when it comes to providing services to these use cases.
I wonder if you're aware that the modal wheelchair user is able to walk at least a few steps. And I raise that question because we don't all have to have somebody else strap us in. Mm-hmm. Also, I can't remember if it was I think it was Sound Transit, on some of their buses has like an automatic arm that comes down mm-hmm. and holds you in place. You know, I would think that some of the same issues would arise with passengers with luggage.
Yes, that's a great call out. And something we've brought up for AV companies to address is what do people do with their belongings? So for example, if you are a wheelchair user who can walk to sit in the seat, where can you store your wheelchair in a safe manner so it's secured and it also gives you enough leg room, for example? That has not been addressed for us. In the case of Waymo, because it uses a standard vehicle, you could put if you have the strength to lift and put it in the trunk, you can. But again, that's something that if there was a human there to assist, there's that piece of human assistance. For the transit self-securing systems, something we've heard is that because they take up so much space, the vehicle platforms that autonomous vehicle companies are developing can't utilize those types of systems. And then many of those vendors that sell those systems still require that the transit operator is verified that the user is secured. But when there's no human operator in the vehicle, that can't be accomplished, which then brings up the challenge of implementing it. Mm-hmm.
Hi, great presentation. Really appreciate all the thought into that. And I can't help feeling, so there's a question at the end of this, I promise, but I really like the matrix that you put where we were looking at all the promises that we thought we were going to get from TNCs, from Uber and Lyft, and how none of those came to pass. And I feel like the reason for that is because these are basically duplicating single occupancy vehicle service. And with the autonomous vehicles that we have promised now, we have zero occupancy vehicle service for a lot of the time because they're just ghost ships. Traveling empty. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like, I guess my question to you and to other folks in the room is, how do we facilitate this technology to actually serve a public good, which is high occupancy, fixed route, real service for people in cities? That we need more transit, we need more transit frequency, we need more transit accessibility. This technology could help with that. And yet, once again, what we're getting instead is a substitute for the transportation that's most impactful and least valuable to our communities.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think something we've struggled with is that when Uber and Lyft sort of hit their peak in operations, they did try out certain things like Uber Pool or I can't remember the name that Lyft used, but it was to group rides together. Yes, shared Lyft, so that you are, let's say you're traveling in the same direction as another rider, it will pair your rides together and you can fit more people into one vehicle. Autonomous vehicle companies initially stated that they would do the same thing. For example, the Zoox vehicle you saw with the 4 seats facing each other, their whole messaging was like, every person's seat is the same, so therefore, like, you should have no issue sharing a ride. But now people have brought up like many safety questions, like how do you deal with passenger safety when you might be riding with a stranger and there's no operator or driver to help you? Or what do you do if someone is maybe harassing you outside of the vehicle and the vehicle is just stationary because it's not going to continue driving? What do you do in that case? More recently, we've heard from the companies like Waymo, for example, that have stated that their service will be a premium service. So I think they're acknowledging sort of where they're going to sit in the market. But at the end of the day, what that looks like is a transportation choice for people that already have many transportation choices. Like the person in San Francisco that calls the Waymo could have easily called an Uber or a taxi or taken transit. Like they have so many choices available to them, and it's not helping anyone who's been left behind by transportation planning and already has really challenging access to transit. So that's, for example, something that we continue to advocate for example, at the state level, when autonomous vehicle deployment legislation comes around, we continue to say that there should be local regulations because we need to either set a requirement for a certain minimum level of service or set a fee so that if the companies aren't going to provide that level of service, we recoup a fee to then pay another vendor to do so.
We have a question from Brian Wood of WashDOT. How does paratransit work without a person to help the riders?
I admittedly am not an expert on paratransit planning, but my understanding is that paratransit would be very difficult to implement without a human attendant, at least to assist. So in the case of May Mobility, who I mentioned earlier, while the vehicle drives itself, there is someone who sits in that driver's seat so that when they do pick up a passenger who needs assistance, they get out and they provide that human assistance. So my understanding is that paratransit would be almost impossible to implement for all population types if there's no attendant.
So I'm looking at, companies that aren't really engaging in good faith. I'm looking at really disturbing stuff about, the person getting dragged. And I'm just wondering why even engage in good faith with these companies, because it doesn't seem like they are. Why, even if it's an issue of not having the ability to preempt it, why wouldn't we do things like make the insurance requirements like so unbearable that they wouldn't operate? Why aren't we giving these companies the fight of their lives? It feels like we're acquiescing instead.
That's a great question. I will say, so in the city of Seattle, our permit program insurance requirements are some of the highest in the country. And the reason we did that was to dissuade risky driving behavior by sort of these companies. For example, Cruise never tested autonomously in Seattle. I don't know if they would feel comfortable had they still been business testing in Seattle, given our high insurance requirement. The challenging piece is that there are some bright spots in how the industry conducts their business. For example, Waymo does a lot of outreach to members of the blind community, as an example. However, we as the city and regulators have to deal with the lowest common denominator. And at the time, very recently, the lowest common denominator was Cruise. They had the riskiest driving behavior. Their vehicles resulted in numerous collisions, and that's who we had to deal with. Now there's been some consolidation. Sort of the better players continue to remain in business. But the biggest challenge we face is that these companies, much like Uber and Lyft, have lots of money and lots of successful lobbyists who are able to convey their message in a way that resonates with state policymakers, which is why they've achieved regulatory preemption. The bill that I mentioned in Washington that's been in session a couple times, it's actually a model bill that's been passed in a dozen other states. So it's written by the AV industry to cater to the needs that they have. And we have a very challenging time overcoming that and advocating for what the city needs at the state level. I will say, we've successfully built coalitions to advance our message. And we've had great partnerships with WashDOT specifically on having them listen to us, because autonomous vehicles, while they eventually might be regulated at the state level, are functionally a city transportation issue. They only operate within city boundaries, and they primarily serve urban customers. And so our engagement with WashDOT has been positive in the sense that they do listen to our experiences because we are the ones with the experience. But yeah, our challenge lies in the narrative that the companies are able to have through the policies that they push, that they've been very successful in doing so.
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciate being reminded of all the issues that the board, whatever we're called, worked on. I'm going to push about one topic because the other thing that's coming is autonomous delivery vehicles. And I think, without knowing as much as maybe I wish I did, that they probably have some of the same regulatory issues and also some of the same operational programming issues. I know at least 2 jurisdictions have called and asked me my opinion about different things. And they do seem like they have a big potential to impact right of way, even if they're only operating in limited parts of a city. So I know I asked this question when we were meeting, so I'm going to ask it again. Who is looking out for how the autonomous delivery vehicles, what their outcomes are from their operations and how reliable and socially responsible they are?
Yeah, great question. So what Doreen's referring to are called sidewalk delivery robots, and they're miniature, cooler-sized autonomous vehicles that drive on the sidewalk or in the bike lane to deliver food or small packages. In Washington State, interestingly enough, there is state regulations for personal sidewalk delivery devices, but that legislation doesn't preempt cities from further regulating them or prohibiting their operation. So the most notable example in Washington was in Kirkland. Amazon launched a sidewalk delivery robot pilot, and it was extremely unsuccessful in the sense that these vehicles would often block curb ramps while they waited for the roadway to clear, which caused a lot of access issues. And so Kirkland eventually kicked them out, and then they shut down the unit. So in that case, the city, like Seattle, does have the ability to say, no, we don't want this, or if you are going to operate it, it needs to operate in a very specific boundary, et cetera. We've had very high-level conversations with those types of companies. The ones that have expressed an interest in launching here, after we talk to them and explain all the challenges and concerns we have not launched here. So I will say that continues to be something that we do have control over.
Mine will be very quick. Thank you so much, Armand. Your presentation's been amazing. Does the city of Seattle have a requirement for the ratio of the remote advisor relative to the number of vehicles that they are controlling?
We do not. So our biggest requirement is that a test driver has to be in every vehicle testing and operating, but we don't set any requirements for remote operations. And the reason being is remote operations typically come into importance when the vehicles have no test driver. So they require that remote monitor to see how the vehicle might be engaging with challenges as they continue driving. But because we have a requirement that someone is sitting in the driver's seat, that's sort of the role that they play. We do know, however, that these companies do require a large amount of remote support. In the case of Cruise, it was reported that as many as 5 employees might monitor a single vehicle at any given time. And that vehicles would require intervention about every 2 to 3 miles, which is quite substantial and makes you think about, you might not see a human in it, but there might be a lot of humans supporting it. So many questions. Part of the impetus for our 911 project is so that we can give that data to those, to their back-end system, essentially, so that their remote advisors are not having to try to make decisions as they approach these emergency scenes, because we know they're really overburdened with the amount of vehicles they're monitoring. And if anyone wants to reach out, you can email us, or if you scan this QR code, it'll take you to the project website, which also has our contact info. Always happy to connect and share more about this topic.